Well, hello again, Grace Fellowship Church, and again, I come to you with some words of encouragement. We started off by pointing out how Paul said to his Philippian friends, I can't be with you, but I want you to stand firm in the Lord. And he goes on to say, the Lord is near, be anxious for nothing. So we ask the question, why does it matter that the Lord is near? Who is this Lord? Well, we began looking at Old Testament names. The very first name in the Bible for God is Elohim. And Elohim means the mighty and powerful God. In Genesis 1:1, this is the God that created the heaven and the earth. So yes, he is the powerful God that you stand firm in. Then we saw the name for God, the second name, El Elyon, which is the Most High God. That means there is no God that supersedes God. There is no God who outranks God. He is the God who possesses heaven and earth. And then we finished up with El Olam. That is the everlasting God. He is the God who never gets tired. He's the God who never wears out. We may lose our patience, we may get tired, but those who wait upon him will renew their strength. Well, we're asking the question today, does God really care? Which takes us to these names of God and why it's important for us to understand what these names are. Because if we're going to answer the question, does God really care? You have to understand the character of God. And here we are in Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6, Jesus is speaking in the Sermon on the Mount, and he addresses the subject of worry. And his answer as to why we should not worry is that, yes, God does care for our situation. He says this in verse 25 of Matthew 6. For this reason I say to you. Now right away, he's reasoning. He wants you to stop emoting, or let me put it this way, to stop acting on your emotions and letting your emotions control you and let your reason control your emotions, okay? It's not that we can stop emoting, but he wants you to stop and reason. He says, for this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life. Don't be worried about your life as to what you're going to eat, what you're going to drink, or your body, or as to what you're going to put on it. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? You see, you have to have an eternal perspective and understand that this life we're living in is not heaven. And this situation that we're in is not eternal. No, this is not heaven. But he points this out. Does God care? He certainly does care. And here's the example he gives. He's talking to them outside and he points to the birds. He says, look at the birds in the air. Now, let me ask you a question. They're not sowing or reaping or gathering into barns. They're certainly not worrying. You don't see birds losing feathers because they're worried about where their food is going to come from. And so he asks this question, aren't you more important than them? The Heavenly Father feeds the birds. Rhetorical question, don't you think you're more important than the birds? Well, of course. And then he says this in verse 27, and which of you, raise your hand, which of you is going to add an extra hour to his life by worrying? Another rhetorical question, because the answer, of course, is zero. There's nobody who's going to add anything to their life by worrying. Certainly, we're to be good stewards of our life and good stewards of our health, but worrying about it is not going to make a difference. And then he says this, why are you worried about your clothes? Observe the lilies of the field. Look at them. They're beautiful, and I don't have to explain to you how beautiful a flower is, and the closer you examine it, the more amazing it is. And he says, they're not toiling, they're not spinning, they're not worried about what's in style or what's not in style. He says, and then his audience would understand this. He says, not even Solomon, in all his glory, his castle, his kingdom, his palace, his riches, his clothes, even Solomon wasn't dressed as beautiful as these flowers. And if, another rhetorical point, if God so clothes the grass of the field, and how important is the grass of the field? Okay, it's beautiful. We look at it. It's alive today. What's going to happen? It's going to die in the fall. It's going to be harvested and burned in a furnace. Now, let me ask you, don't you think he's going to clothe you? And then he adds this, you of little faith. What does he mean when Jesus says you of little faith? Is he saying you don't have enough positive mental attitude? No, that's not what he means. Is he saying you don't have enough wishful, hopeful thinking? That's not what he means. No, faith is based on truth. And he is saying you are not putting into practice what you should already know about God. That's why we've been looking at the Old Testament names for God, because they describe the character of God. And since the character of God is unchanging, that's what we base our faith on. So he says again, second time in verse 31, so don't worry then. Don't worry, what are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? What are we going to wear? Listen, the rest of the world, the unsaved people, the people who are not children of God, they eagerly seek after these things. And so, yes, you see a world on the news that is desperately worrying, desperately anxious about getting their needs met in this crisis. He says, they seek after these things for your heavenly Father. So how much do you know about your Heavenly Father? And how much do you trust your Heavenly Father? Your Heavenly Father knows you have needs of these things. He's not up in heaven wringing his hands, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? No, and he knows you have needs of these things. So he goes on and he says this in verse 33. Keep seeking his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be provided for you. That's what you do. The world says, no, there's a pyramid, there's a hierarchy of needs, and you have to have all your base needs met. And when you have all those base needs met, well then, and only then, can you start trusting God and you start serving others. He says, no, that's backwards. He says, first thing you do is seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and God's got your back. Seek his kingdom and his righteousness. So do not worry. Third time he says it. Do not worry about tomorrow. Here's why. For tomorrow will take care of itself. Listen, each day has enough trouble of its own. And when he says that, we realize, yes, Jesus is not saying there's not going to be trouble today. No, he's saying you seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and I got your back. There will be trouble today, but what do you do with your trouble? Pastor Sam said the other day in 1 Peter 5 verse 7, he reminded us how we humble ourselves before the mighty hand of God. And what do? We cast all our anxiety and our care upon him. Here's why. For he cares for you. The question, does God care? He does indeed. Cast all your anxiety upon him.